Hey everyone, this is Jalen with Daily Code Tips. In this tutorial, we're going to go through and build out 3 components. And if you can build out these components, then you're guaranteed to land a job as a React developer. So in this first component, and this is going to be a series. Basically, we're going to have 3 videos where we're going to do 1 component each video. And in this first video, we're going to do, the first component is going to be a API component. It'll basically call a JSON placeholder API and render the results. Now this sounds simple, but it's going to be how we set it up. It's going to be the architecture of it, and it's going to be the layout and everything that we do that's going to make this production worthy. It's going to make you a React master. So getting started, I have a basic create React app application. I've deleted a couple files, index.css and app.css. Those are removed. In this tutorial, I may make a few mistakes, and we're going to work through it. I'm not going to cut anything out. We're going to work through the errors, because as a software engineer, you need to be able to Google and figure out what's wrong with the problem instead of asking anybody else who's out there to give you the answer. So for this, there's not going to be any edits here. So we're going to get started with looking at the JSON placeholder API. So that's the first step. We need to know exactly what we're looking at before we start writing the code. For this example, I'm just going to use this one here. And this one is just basically a bunch of to-dos. It's just an array of objects that have just a title, and if it's completed or whatever the case, we'll just render these out as just blocks on the screen. So that's what we're going to call. We'll just go ahead and just call this API. And this is the URL here. So to get started, there's a certain way I like to set up my architecture, especially when I'm calling APIs. So we're going to have a store. And that store is basically going to be our main store, right, for Redux. And we're going to have one reducer, which is going to handle, it's going to take the state that comes back from the Saga, the API call, and it's going to store that in a reducer so that we can use that later on in a component. And then we're going to have one Saga, which will basically initiate the API call. And I'll show you some cool ways with Sagas that Sagas allow a lot of flexibility with API calls, and we'll get into that. And that should be about it for our architecture and setting up the API itself. Obviously, we'll have some components, and we'll get into that as well. So to start off, we have a main app. This is what's rendering on the page. It's just, hey, that's it. It's the only thing that's on the page. And in case you didn't know, in order to get to this point, we would run a command like npx create react app and then the name of the app, right? And that'd be like, I don't know, it could be anything, right? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a folder, and we're going to make sure that these components, this architecture is clean and well organized. So we're going to have a components directory, and let's go ahead and set up for the future how we're going to do this. So we're basically going to have results. This is what we're going to render out to the screen after we finish the API call. And then we're going to have, let's say for this example, all we're doing is going to be calling this API. So we can just do this on mount. So we'll just go ahead and do that on mount whenever the component mounts. Or actually, I'll just put a button here, execute placeholder. That's what I'll do. So we'll have a button and execute. Basically, we'll have a button that will initiate the API call and then render the results on the screen. So The reason I say that this will make you an expert in React is because if you know how to do this very well and easily, and you understand the architecture and you can get it done quickly, this is pretty much the most common thing that React developers do. They call APIs, they render it as results. That's pretty much what happens. I mean, the user interactivity and all of that comes into play, and those are going to be in the next component that I show in the next video. But for this one, we'll just do the API portion. Usually a React developer, it's user interactivity, there's the API calls. That's pretty much the big portion of React, and what a front-end developer would be doing is just handling that front-end interaction. So what I'm going to get started out doing is I'm going to go ahead and add a few packages in here. So we're going to do yarn add Redux Saga, and we'll add React Spring to that. All right, and then that's going to take some time. So we need to set up our store. So we're going to create a folder called store, and in here we'll have a file called create store.js. And we'll go ahead and add import create store from Redux. And we'll need a few things. So before we even get our store ready to go, we're going to need a reducer and we're going to need a Saga. So I'll go ahead and add into my component in the execute placeholder. I'll have a directory called Redux. And in here, we will need a Saga and a reducer to handle everything that we're going to do in Redux. So the first file that we're going to need to have is let's call it execute placeholder saga.js. And we'll have another one called execute placeholder reducer.js. Now the Saga is going to handle the API call. Basically, the pattern is going to be a user clicks the button, then the button dispatches out an action, the Saga catches the action, and then the Saga will run an API call, and then it will put that into the reducer. The reducer will save it in state, and then we'll have that we'll have that in the store. And then inside of another component, any component, we can basically subscribe to that store, and then we can access everything in the store from that point on. So we'll have those files ready to go in here, and I'll create an index.js file in here inside of execute placeholder. We want to import React from React, and then have our function execute placeholder. This is going to be our component. Export default execute placeholder, and we will return some JSX. And this right here is just a shorthand notation for fragment. React has a fragment that allows you to just put an empty div in there, and this is just shorthand notation for that. So we'll just go ahead and add a button, and then we'll just say click me, right? Now we'll go ahead and use some state. Now this is a hook in React. The old way of doing this was in a class component, but recently React has added hooks which allow you to use state inside of a functional component, and also you can use lifecycle methods inside of it as well. So in here we can say something like on click, and how use state works is basically, let's say we have a variable here, we can say clicking, and we can say update clicking, and use state false. So right here, this one is going to be the value, and then this one is going to be the function. This will just update whatever this is, right? So this is going to change every time we call this. So an on click, what we can do is we can say update clicking, and then pass in true or false, right? Right now it's false. So when we click this, clicking will be true. So we could do anything with that conditionally. Now, so what we want to do is, let's just say right here, we'll go ahead and on click, we want to initiate the API call. So I'm going to create a function. I'm going to say call placeholder. All right. I'm going to say call placeholder. And I want to pass in, and I'll just put this in here, call placeholder. And basically what we want to do is we want to first say update clicking. We want to set that to true, because what I want to do is I want to conditionally change the name of this. I want to say if clicking is true, then we'll go ahead and say downloading placeholders. Then right here we'll go ahead and say click me, right? So if we're not clicking, we'll say click me, and then when we do it, it'll say downloading placeholders. Then afterwards we'll execute the API. So we'll execute the API itself. All right, so a good way to do this, and this is a quick way of doing it right here using state. We could also use Redux as well to dispatch out an action that will call this, execute it, and then deactivate it as well inside of the Saga. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and keep this, and we'll change it in a second. But for the execute API, what we want to do is we're going to have our placeholder Saga, and we're going to import. So we only want this to run the very last time that a user clicks it. So I'll go ahead and say take latest. So when a user clicks that button, it will take the latest API call. So if they happen to click it 100 times, it'll take the last one. And I'll take put and call from Redux Saga dash effects. And we'll have a function here which will be set execute execute placeholder Saga, and we'll have another function called watch execute placeholder Saga, and we'll export default the watch execute placeholder Saga. So what's happening here is the watch execute placeholder Saga is listening in for an action that'll be dispatched, and when it's dispatched, it'll run this set execute placeholder Saga, which we haven't done yet. So this right here, if you're not familiar, is a generator function, and it allows you to use yield statements inside of your functions. So it basically allows you to use synchronous coding. So if you write a yield statement, it will run one by one. We all know that JavaScript uses promises asynchronous, but here we can do yield statements and run them one by one. So in this, what we'll do is we'll call take latest, and we want to dispatch out an action. So it needs to listen in for some sort of type. So it'll say we'll export const get placeholders, and we'll just say get placeholders, and we'll put that in here, and we'll call set execute placeholder Saga. So it's listening in for an action called get placeholders, and it'll call this function when it gets it. We'll yield, and then we want to call an API, right? So a good way to do this is to do yield call and then the name of the function. So we'll say get placeholders, and then we pass in our values that we need, but for this case we don't really need a value. So get placeholders API call. Now usually when I have a lot of sagas, a lot of API calls, I split them up into different functions, but into different files. But into here we'll go ahead and we'll add this right here, and I'll just log out to the screen getting placeholders, so we know that all this stuff is working properly. And Once that's done, we need to connect these sagas, this reducer, into our store. Right? We don't have a store. We don't have anything connected at all. These are just files basically at this point. So we also need, before we even get into the store, we need a reducer as well. So like I said before, we click the button. It's going to call placeholder right here, which will call some sort of action, and that will dispatch the action, and this saga will wait for it and then run this function, and this will eventually call this API right here, which is just logs to the screen. No, nothing happens here. So right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have const initial state is equal to, and the initial state is going to be placeholders, which will be a empty array. And then we'll go ahead and say const execute placeholder, or actually I'll say, yeah, const execute placeholders reducer is equal to, we'll put that in there, and I don't know, I did that. We'll put that in there, and then we'll export default the execute placeholders reducer, and we want the state to be equal to the initial state by default, and then we want to have an action in there. So what we're gonna do is the reducer basically just listens for an action, and then it just changes the state. That's all it does. So what we're gonna do is we'll say if, and the action that we're gonna wait for, so this one right here, get placeholders, this action needs to be different from the reducer's action. So this one right here is just gonna be, we'll call it watch get placeholders. So this is the one that watches for the placeholders. And then this right here is gonna be set placeholders. This will be the action that will basically set the placeholders in state. So I will import that into the reducer, set placeholders, and I'll put that in here. And if the action's type is equal to that type, then we will return a different form of state. Now Redux is immutable, so that means that it can't change the original object. So what we're going to need to do, and what I tend to do to make things easier, is I tend to go ahead and add immutable JS, and I actually need to go into the file that I was in, and I didn't add Redux Saga, and immutable, and Rex Spring. So we're going to need the package immutable JS. So with that, what we'll do is we'll import map and from JS from immutable. This will allow us to use immutability inside of our React application. We can change original objects, we can merge and use that feature. So we'll say map, and go ahead, and then inside of here we'll say return state dot merge. What this will do is whatever field you put in here, it'll change it based off of the value that you go ahead and put in. So I'll say action dot placeholders, right? And then so when this action is dispatched, this reducer will catch this action. It'll check if action dot type, the action that was dispatched, is equal to the set placeholders action, which is this one. And if it is the same one, then it will merge that state that came back from the saga, and then we can use that for later on. Otherwise, we'll just return the state if it's not, because Redux will complain if nothing is returned. So from this, I'll have from JS in the application, and I will go ahead and just make sure all this stuff works. So right now, the next step is to go ahead and add it and to create our store. So we want to import our execute placeholder reducer from components execute placeholder redux execute placeholder reducer. We also want to import our saga, which is going to be execute placeholder saga from components execute placeholder redux and then saga. Now we're going to have const store is equal to create store. This is going to take a root reducer. We only have one reducer right now, so we can just go ahead and add execute placeholder reducer. We're also going to need apply middleware. We need to apply some middleware inside of this store, and that's going to be our saga, our execute placeholder saga. And the way we set up our sagas, from what I remember, it would just say, let's say create saga middleware, and that's going to come from redux saga, I believe. And let me see, redux saga. And then here we're going to have const saga middleware, where equals create saga middleware, and that's just a function. We're going to pass that function in here, and then we're going to do saga middleware.run, and we're going to pass the execute placeholder saga in there. I think that should work. Then we're just going to export. We need to go ahead and export the store as well. So export default to store, because the main application is going to need to have access to that. All right, so back here, we're going to then import the store into the main application. So we're going to go into store, create store, and we need a provider. So we're going to say import provider from React Redux. Now I don't think we have this package, so we're going to go ahead and add that package. So yarn add React Redux. What this is going to do is going to allow us to connect Redux into our React application with this provider, and we're going to pass in this store, which we just created. We added in the saga middleware, the reducer, and that's how we created our store. It's pretty much a one-time thing. You just have to remember the steps in it. It's really not that easy to remember because you don't do it that often when you're working in a React application. But here, that's just what you have to do to set up your React Redux application. So let's say provider store, and then we'll pass in the store. Now we also want to put the component in there, which is execute placeholder, right? And this basically just has a button, and when you click it, it doesn't really do anything. It just updates some state. So let's make sure that is working. We'll see. Click, and it says downloading placeholders like that. I don't want that to be inside of the button. I'll just have click me, and then we'll just have some raw text right here, which will say downloading placeholders when we click it. And then when we click it, we want the button to disappear because we don't want them to click it again. So we'll just say if we're clicking, then we will remove that button, and this will be null, or actually should be the other way around here. This will be null like that. So that's what we'll do. So this will disappear, downloading placeholders. And then the next step would to be actually calling that saga. And this will be called with an action. So the way that's going to happen is we're going to export an action. We'll say get placeholders action is equal to, and it'll have a type, and that type is going to be the watch get placeholders, because that's what the saga is watching out for. So it's going to be get placeholders, and then it's going to have a it's not going to have a value, so we're just going to go ahead and just have that. That's all it's going to have. It's just going to have a type that dispatches out the action. That's it. And then All right, so now that we have this action, basically we want to call this action. We're going to dispatch out this action directly from the component. So we want to import that into our component,
Okay, I don't want
this actions, and this should, I want to call this action, not actions. We'll call that action. And in the component, what we'll do is we need to connect this to the store. So React Redux comes with a connect function here. This hired a component that basically allows you to connect to the store. And what we need to have is an object that basically maps your actions to your component. So map dispatch to props equals, and then we'll pass that action in there, and then we'll pass this function into this hired component. Then what that allows us to do is this action goes directly onto props, and we can basically just do like props dot get placeholder action, and then we can just call it straight up like that. So right here, when we call this function called placeholder, we'll also call this placeholder action as well. And what that will do is it'll call this Saga. This Saga will wait for it. It'll set this. It'll call this function, and this API call will be called. So then all this does right now is just log it to the screen. So if we look at it, we click getting placeholder. So all that stuff worked. The Saga caught it. The reducer caught it. Everything just worked out perfectly with that. So the next step is to actually call the API. And the API we're calling is this, obviously. So I'm not sure if this takes a limit or anything, but you know what? I'll call it directly like this. So I'm going to go ahead and add a package called Axios. Axios is going to be what I'm going to use to call the API. So I'm going to say import Axios from Axios. And I will say, since I'm using a generator function, I can use yields to do this synchronously, so I don't have to use like async await or anything like that. I'm going to say const data is equal to Axios dot get. The URL is this, right? And then I don't think it requires a body or anything, so that's fine. Let's console.log data and see what we get from that API call. Pending promise. We need to put yield here. This will make this whole line synchronous. If we don't, it'll be an asynchronous call, it'll be a promise when we log it. So let's do it again. All right, data. Now all the information is in data, and we have this array full of JSON objects, and it's 200 of them, which is a lot. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do, let me just log, it's data.data, I believe. Let me see. To get to those placeholders. Yeah, so this is everything we need. Data.data, which is just a bunch of placeholders here. All right. That's what we'll do, and that's what we'll just map through that. Now, is this, let me see something here. Maybe this is just Google doing this. Yeah, that's just Google doing that. Okay. I was just a little bit confused for a second. Okay, so we have our 200 JSON placeholders that just came back from the API. Now what do we want to do? After we've just called that API, we want the reducer to know about it. So we're going to dispatch out another action that the reducer will catch it and then save it in the store. So the next step will be to yield put, and then inside of put we will pass in the data, and we need another action because Redux reducers require an action to be dispatched out. So we'll say set placeholder action, which will equal. Now in a larger application, you always want to split your actions out. So I would have another file called actions. I have another file called types, which will be here, and I'll just split these out. Now for this one, we'll go ahead and do type, and we'll do set placeholders. That's what we'll set. And inside of put, we will set placeholders, and we expect a placeholder array. So we'll have placeholders in here inside of this action, and then we'll just pass in data.data, which is all of the placeholders. What this will do is it'll dispatch out an action. That's what put does. It's basically just dispatching out an action, which is this action type set placeholders. A reducer will be waiting for that action, set placeholders, and then it will merge it into the state. Now, that's what we'll do. We can also add to this reducer loading as well. If we wanted to, we can also add another field here for loading, and we can do something like, yield put loading true, which will just tell the reducer that loading is true, and then we inside of state, whenever that is changed, we can change the loading of the application, and then when this is done, we can turn it to false and just turn it off. And each time this will run synchronously, so this will wait before it turns the loading off. Now we can do that, and that's a challenge that I'm gonna that I hope you guys actually go out and do yourself. But for the meantime, we'll go ahead and just finish out this API call here. So we're gonna put this action, and we'll have that in there. Now let's see if this actually worked. We'll go to the results folder. We'll add an index.js. And let's go ahead and just make a component, which will be our results. So function results will return a component. We'll return a component, export default results. And inside of here, we're going to render the results. Now we need to connect to the store in order to have access to any of that state. So we'll say from React Redux, we will connect to it. And we need to map the state to the props, just like we did with the function. So we'll say map state to props. And this one is going to be a function instead of an object. And in the store, we have this execute placeholder reducer, which has this placeholder state right there. So right here, what we can do is we can say state, or we can say placeholders is state.placeholders, right? And then we'll just pass that in there, and we'll go to props, and we can actually, instead of calling props in here, we can do some object destructuring, and then take the placeholders out of it, and console.log the placeholders. So let's see if that actually worked. We'll do that. And okay. All right, so nothing came back. Oh, obviously because we need to actually put the component inside of the application. The application wasn't even rendering the component. So let's do that. Click it, and okay, it's undefined. So nothing changed. It's undefined. It's undefined because this is a mutable object. So we can't just reference it directly. We need to call .get on it. And that will come back as an array and then a list, which is an immutable array object. And if we look at this, we have all our data here. Let's take a look. Root, entries, user ID, title. We have all our stuff here that we need, and size is 200. So we know that's what we're looking at. Now let's go ahead and render that list. We'll say placeholder, render placeholders. That's what we'll say. And we'll just go ahead and say const, and we will render the placeholders. We will take the placeholders and pass it in, and we'll say if placeholders, then we will do return placeholders.map placeholder, and we will return a placeholder component That's what we'll do. So, okay, so what we will do is we will go ahead and we'll create this placeholder component, and we have our file placeholder.js. So we'll import react.js, React from React. And what we're doing, we're mapping through all the placeholders, and we're going to return a placeholder object and pass in the placeholder as a prop. So we're going to go back to the placeholder, and we are going to say function placeholder and return that. Export default placeholder. We'll return some JSX. Let's just say placeholder for now. Let's make sure that that renders everything. So we'll click it, and it renders the 10 placeholders from the user's API. So in here, we can get access to our placeholder object with some object destructuring, and we can take a look at what's on the placeholder so that we can render some of that data. And if we look, we can actually also convert this to a JavaScript object since it's a mutable JS. And we can look here, we have a company, we have all this stuff. Right now, we'll just print out the name and email. So we're going to use a package called AntDesign. So we'll go ahead and do yarn add AntDesign. And actually already have added this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import card from AntDesign/lib/card, and I will put in this card. It takes a title, so the title is going to be placeholder.email, and then inside of the body I'm just going to have placeholder.name, and shouldn't see anything right now, I don't believe. Let's see, should at least see some data on there. Let's go ahead and get AntDesign CSS CDN. So we need the CDN in order for the styles to come in. So we'll say AntDesign.min.css, and we'll put that in the public index.html file. This will be a link rel equals style sheet, href equals the CSS. And inside of this placeholder, let's see if that worked out. We'll go back, and it changed around the look of it a little bit. So the cards are in there. Let's change the styling up a little bit. We'll say width 200, and then height 200, margin left 20, and we will say test, and I'll have right here this div style margin top 30. All right, just for demonstration purposes. All right, so we have all of these coming out. Now we don't have the data on there right now, so I must be printing something out incorrectly. Let's take a look at the placeholder again, because I'm calling placeholder.name, so that's undefined. What we want to do is we'll say const data equals placeholder.toJS, because these are mutable objects, so we need to convert it into a regular object. So we look back, we'll do it again, click it, and then there we have it. We have all these random users and email addresses. I'll go ahead and just say margin top 20 or 10 as well, just add that to it. And I'll also say that that's what we'll do for that. And what I'll do now is we'll go ahead and use React Spring. We want to animate these in. So that's another skill that you should know how to, that you should have, animating things in for just user satisfaction. So we'll use React Spring for that. And they have this component here that you can use. We can just pass in Spring, and then you can add some CSS and just put in your component. Just like that. And all it takes is you need to pass on a style property with that prop. So I'll just say style and then props on there. We want to import the spring from React Spring / render props. Now what that should do is just animate the opacity of it like that. Now a cool thing that we can do is to do it one by one. So we'll just take this iterator that's on the placeholder map and we'll say I, pass on I, and then bring I in there. We can use this to delay it. So we'll put a config on there and we will delay by I times say 100. And this will delay each animation one by one like that. So it looks cleaner. We could also do our transform, translate Y 30 pixels, transform, translate Y 0 pixels. What this will do is it'll animate it up. So we'll say just like that. Looks really pretty. Now, what I also like to do with these cards is I like to give it a background. I'm going to use styled components. So I'll say yarn add styled components. And what we can do with that is we can say, well, actually, we don't need style components for now. We'll just we'll add these on, and you can do any architectural changes with styling, but this was more of a demonstration for Redux and React work. Right now we're kind of making things look pretty, but I like to change the background to white. And alright, so what I like to do is I like to go ahead and put a box shadow on there. So I actually have this box shadow here ready to go, and we can go ahead and attach that, and let's see what that looks like. And that looks super clean, right? There's so many things that you can do with this. Just writing this component alone shows you have a very bright future for you with React. So practice this architecture, practice everything. Make sure that you get this down pat. And in the next upcoming videos, we will focus on user interaction. We'll focus on other components that can help you become a master with React. So thank you for listening in on this tutorial. This is Daily Code Tips, and I'm out.